Hey there, Galaxy fans. Switch to Sprint and get both an unlimited plan and the Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus included for just $35 per month per line for 5 lines. All you need is approved credit and an 18-month lease. No trade-in required. Visit a Sprint store, sprint.com, or call 800-SPRINT-1. S10 Plus 128 gigabytes after $26.67 per month credit. Apply within 2 bills if canceled early. Remaining balance due. Unlimited basic after $131.21. Pay $32 per month per line with auto pay. Coverage and offer not available everywhere. Excludes taxes, fees, and roaming. Speed maximums use. Rules $30 activation fee and restrictions apply.
When I woke up this morning, I was feeling pretty dangerous.
All right, yeah, our roster looks great on paper. Whoop-de hell. All right. But at the end of the day, we better be a good team. And you start building that during this time of the year.
Get your sorry ass up! Get your sorry ass up! Doing a lot of talking with somebody that ain't do shit today. Doing a lot of talking.
Do you think you're better than Jarrell Revis is right now?
I'm better than you. My 24 years of life, I'm better at life than you.
James! Time to go to work! I ain't 36. I ain't never seen you before, huh? Better go tell the coach you need some help. We gonna expose you, boy. Alright, we coming at your ass.
Welcome to the Fantasy Football Roundtable.
Let's go!
What's going on, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Football Roundtable Podcast, proud members of the Full-Time Fantasy Podcast Network. You can find them at FTFPodNet on Twitter. You can find me, your host, Matthew Bruning, at SportsFanaticMB on Twitter. We are just one of a ton of great podcasts associated with this network, though, some of which are Jim Day of FF Champs, Corey Parsons and Dr. Roto from SiriusXM Radio, Mr. Bob Lung, the award-winning Fantasy Football Consistency Guide and the creator of the Midwest Fantasy Expo, Dwayne McFarland, Blake Sullivan, and a ton of great others, and you can find all of us on FullTimeFantasy.com, your one-stop shop for all of your fantasy news, advice, and strategies. We at the Roundtable are also excited to be partnering with ExpandTheBoxScore.com. You can find them at XTBoxScore on Twitter. They have some of the most advanced stats in football, baseball, basketball, and college football. College football stats are extremely hard to find. For just $15 a year, you can look at all of these. I'm telling you guys, it is well worth it. If you like to dive into the analytical side of sports I use it for prospects, college football prospects specifically, it is amazing. It goes down to the minutest of details in this stuff. And again, it's just $15 a year. If you use our code ROUNDTABLE, you will get 10% off of that, which is a steal of a deal, if I do say so myself, and probably the best deal in the industry. So definitely check them out, especially if you want to get a jump on the upcoming draft class. It'll be well worth your time and money. What's going on, guys? It's me, Matt, back at it again today. So we've got our special guest finally joining us for the podcast. We've been talking about it for about a week now. I've been trying to get it all lined up. Unfortunately, Dennis and them couldn't be here. It'll just be me, but I've got him coming on here as a very special guest. I'm excited to dive into a different side of Dynasty and fantasy football that I'll be honest, I'm not that good with. I'm not that good with the numbers and analytical stuff. I pay mostly attention to what I see with my eyes. I just feel like I trust my evaluations of certain things. Sometimes it's cost me. Sometimes it's been really good, as all you guys know who have been with us for a while now. So I'm excited to bring him on here. We are going to talk about the analytics of Dynasty. I'm going to have Mr. Jordan McNamara with me. I cannot wait for you guys to hear this podcast. We recorded an interview a little bit earlier. It's going to come up here right now. Make sure to follow him on Twitter at McNamara Dynasty, McNamara Dynasty. I'm telling you guys, it is well worth it. As you'll hear throughout the podcast, he gives a ton of great information that it could help you guys, not just this year, but moving forward. He's got a great book we'll talk about throughout the entire podcast. And then make sure to stick around to the very end as he gives you a lot of different ways that you can find out the stuff that he puts out there. And I promise you, this may cost me listeners or viewers or followers on Twitter because this guy really knows what he's talking about. He points out a lot of good things and kind of flips the myths and flips the narratives on some stuff that we've all kind of been told our entire Dynasty lives that we thought was true. And he kind of proves how it may not be quite as true as we thought it was with the analytics and everything that he's put behind it. So I really hope you guys enjoy the interview. Make sure to please rate, review, and subscribe on the podcast when you guys get a chance, or if you guys get a chance. And I'm going to jump Jordan on now, and let's get this rolling. And as I mentioned in the intro there, we finally were able to get our times coordinated, and our special guest is Jordan McNamara, the author of the Analytics of Dynasty. He is a contributor to UTH Dynasty and a member of the SFWA. Jordan, thank you so much for jumping on the roundtable with me. I wish I could have gotten Dennis or Matt on here with me, but they unfortunately had some stuff going on. Dennis is dealing with family stuff, and Matt is in Disneyland, so you just get me. But we are glad to have you here and talk about the Analytics of Dynasty. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm colder than you are, but I am.
Yeah.
I'm good. Everything's good.
Yeah, so tell everybody, we were talking a little bit here right before we started recording. Where are you at and what the weather is like for you? Because I always like to joke because Dennis and Matt lives in Colorado, Dennis in Ohio, so they always have much worse weather than me here in Texas. Where are you at right now, and how's the weather for you?
I am in Syracuse, New York, and it is very cold. Fortunately, no precipitation. The roads are clear, but it is very cold outside. So, although it's nicer than it has been in the last couple of weeks, but we're in a deep freeze. We're in a deep freeze. Yeah.
See, that's the one thing I always talk about, how much I miss being in Ohio. I've considered myself an Ohio native, even though I've technically lived in Texas longer. But I love being up north. I'm someone who loves the cold weather. I get made fun of all the time down here when it gets into like the 20s, 30s. I'm still walking around in like shorts and a shirt just because I'm fine with the cold weather. But that is the one thing I don't miss, is the deep freezes and everything that you guys go through. Maybe it's because Texans don't know how to drive on ice and snow, and they still try and go 60 and 70 through everything. But I don't miss any of that one bit. Glad that I get to deal with my 50 to 60s, sometimes 30-degree weather down here.
Yeah, totally. It's funny. I lived in Ohio when I went to school, and I'm fully familiar with like driving through snow. And some of the people there, like it was Western Ohio, but some of the people there were like really nervous to go out and drive in the snow. And I'm like, we're joyriding through the snowstorms. So it's a different experience, I'm sure, down south.
Oh yeah. Like I said, we were talking right before we started recording, and like I told you that I think the last time, it had to have been close to 5 years ago, we had really bad ice down here. And, again, me being from up north, I've driven on ice before. I used to go back to Ohio all the time, visit family and everything. So I know, like, you can drive on it, but you don't want to go 67. We have these Texans and their souped up trucks trying to go 80 down the highway. And as soon as they hit that patch of ice, just spinning, hitting cars, it's ridiculous. Like, yeah, you gotta respect it a little bit, but they don't know. They don't understand what ice is down here. Like I said, we had a little bit of a light dusting is what they called it down here, and the snow landed on the ground and stayed there for maybe an hour. Once the sun came up, it was gone. Looked like it had just rained outside. We don't understand snow, ice, any of that here in Texas.
We would celebrate that in January, so yeah, it would be.
I imagine so.
It'd be a great day up here.
All right, so let's jump into some of these the questions I've got here for you. What I like to do whenever we bring on a new guest is just to kind of let our listeners learn a little bit about you. Everybody comes from obviously different backgrounds, have done all different kinds of stuff in fantasy. So just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, how you got started in the industry.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I have played fantasy football I was trying to do the math on it the other day. I think it's like since like 96 or 97, somewhere in that range. So since I was like 10 or 11, and I have just played all the way through, and I played, I primarily played season long, and I was in a keeper league, a little bit deeper of a keeper league, but in 2012 I started playing Dynasty, and then 2012, 2013, 2014, I just kept picking up more Dynasty leagues and playing more Dynasty leagues, and so in 2016 I got the opportunity to do some podcasting and some writing at uthdynasty.com. Chad Parsons was kind enough to bring me on, and it's funny, we just first started talking, we would just watch college games for Devy stuff, and I never played Devy, but I liked watching games. We'll just talk about it and doing those sorts of things. So I initially started doing a lot of tape stuff, and the numbers had always interested me, and so I sort of it would have been 2018. I was doing more numbers work, and I'm still doing stuff at UTH, and I wanted to play more DFS, so I decided to do a whole bunch of DFS research, and I basically spent the month of like January and February of like 2018 just like doing numbers research and looking at a whole bunch of stuff for DFS, and I just kept coming back to thinking like, there is like dynasty stuff in this data.
Right.
And there's just a lot of dynasty stuff. So I overlaid a bunch of ADP on it and went back 10 years, did a whole bunch of research, compared, different types of profiles and stuff. And I just started writing the stuff down just to take notes on it, because I figured maybe it'd be a podcast or an article or something. And through the course of like a few weeks, it ended up being like 40 pages just of like notes. And I was like, wow, I have like a book length type deal here. So I decided to write the Analytics of Dynasty 1 and the 2019 edition. And I went through all of that, and it was great. And it was a lot of fun, a great experience. I think it went better than I could have expected starting out when I decided to actually write it. And then so all the conversations that I had with that book release and coming through that whole process, I had even more questions in 2019, the summer of 2019. And so I said, I'm going to write a second edition, and it looks a lot at Superflex and different ways to like look at player progression. Like if a player hasn't hit, like what does that mean? And sort of what does that mean for his expectations? What a player does hit, sort of how does that move the needle? I looked at a lot of different lineup constructions, roster constructions, different ideas about how picks should be valued, and a whole bunch of different concepts like that. And I said, let's do the second edition. So I have the 2020 edition, and it's on sale now. And I think we could probably get into it a little bit more.
Yeah, I actually already bought a copy. I'm not good with the numbers. I don't know if you see, I write for Dynasty Nerds, and so a lot of the stuff that I do comes based on what I watch and what I see. Cause I like you, I love watching college football. I actually just got into Devy Leagues, this past season. I had not really ever played in them. Which is an interesting thing for me. I've actually come to really enjoy it. You did say that you were in a lot of leagues. Before we jump into that, I like to jump around. I'm bad about that. How many leagues are you in?
Dynasty leagues, I'm in 20, and I played a couple of keeper leagues, or a keeper league, like a home league, and then a couple of other leagues. I think I played 25 total, and 20 of them were dynasty leagues this year.
That's awesome. See, most of the people we bring on here are like way less than that. So last year, I'm trying to trim down. I keep telling myself I'm going to, and I haven't yet. But I've luckily
Famous last words.
Yeah, I have not taken any more on, which I think is a good move for me. But I was in 38 last year, so I was. Wow. Yeah, and the worst part about it is, I'm sure I don't know, I would assume with that, there are some of them that when you get to those middle of the pack teams, it's I kind of let them go. Like, I just kind of, like, I'm just going to set my lineup, didn't improve, didn't sell off, and I feel like that's kind of hurt me, is why I wanted to cut down a little bit, because I don't like being middle of the pack or non-contenders kind of thing.
Yeah. I'm curious, when you, like, people have asked me, people that aren't into Dynasty.
Yeah.
Really. And so when we sort of get talking about the book, and they say, how many leagues are you in? And I tell them, and their jaw drops. And I usually say to them, I'm like, listen, the difference between playing like 2 leagues or 3 leagues and playing 20, like, isn't, like, once you go from like 1 to 2 or like 1 to 3, like the difference between 3 and 20 isn't that big.
No,
like it might seem like a huge number, but in terms of like time commitment and all the research you're already doing, I would imagine for you it's just basically an application of a process, I would imagine.
Yeah. So I've talked about it before, but for me, I feel like it's a little bit easier for me because I have 2 young kids. And so my wife works nights, so I have all night to myself pretty much. So like when I know a lot of people I've talked to, like, well, how do you find time to spend with your family and everything? Well, I take the nights are my time. Once I put my kids to sleep, it's time for me to do, as you said, I've already done studying on a bunch of other stuff. At that point, it's just going through waiver wires. And it's not that hard because I imagine with the dynasty leagues you're in are the same as mine. They're deep leagues and the rosters are deep. So chances are you're not going out there. A guy I like to talk about, that obviously a lot of people probably were able to pick up a couple years ago was Philip Lindsay. He's a guy that I really liked coming out of college. I thought he might do something, ended up hitting. I was able to grab him in a ton of leagues because of that. Chances are, though, most dynasty leagues, you're not finding many guys on the waiver wire. So at that point, it's not hard to go, as you just mentioned, from 3 to 20 leagues because you're kind of scrolling through the same names and deciding what moves I want to make. So you maybe spend an hour altogether going through your stuff where people think you're spending like an hour on each league, and that's just not the case.
Yeah, it's interesting that each year I try and do something different in my dynasty habits. So like one of the things that 2 years ago, I was like, I have to be better at waivers. So I've really tried to get better at waivers. And the other thing that I've been trying to do, like this year, I said I need to have like a more streamlined lineup process. And so I don't know for you, like, I don't know if I could do 38 in the time that I do it, but like I take from when I'm on the East Coast or Eastern time zone. So from like 11:30 until 1 on a Sunday when the lineups are going, or when we first get the inactives. So like the Sunday afternoon inactives. Like I spend basically from 11:30 to 1 just like inputting lineups. I would imagine like you probably can't do that in 90 minutes with that many teams, but like, I don't know for you, like that's just sort of one of the things that I've done just to manage. I have to block out this time and I have to do it in this time and then just do it essentially.
Yeah, I would say for me, again, I feel like it always comes back to where your situation, I guess is the way to put it. I have a wife who is somewhat understanding of this addiction is what I like to call it. So when it comes to me sitting there and like Sundays, she doesn't really bother me as much when it comes to that. So I'm able to sit there and do it. Now, I don't usually have time. The way I do it is I set my lineups usually Wednesday nights, Thursday mornings. Usually my Thursdays with my job, I'm usually afforded a lot of free time. So I kind of go through all my lineups, then set my lineups, and then I have a spreadsheet of guys that I have question marks on if I want to move them out, if they might be injured and everything, and then I kind of go over that Sunday. So for the most part, I unfortunately kind of set most of my lineups on Thursday. Now I've got, I'd say 12 leagues that I'm really passionate about. Those I do exactly what you were just talking about when it comes to Sundays. Those are ones that I'm paying a lot amount of attention to, just trying to get through, make sure I'm setting the perfect lineup, probably overanalyzing it, pulling players out I shouldn't, as I'm sure a lot of everybody does now these days. They kind of overanalyze everything. So that's the way that I do it. But yeah, it's a interesting process, because I'm with you. A lot of people, when I say that, they're like, well, how do you have the time, or where do you find the time to do it? And it's not that big a difference. Like, I completely agree with what you say. If people give it a shot, now I wouldn't suggest doing 38. I even think 25 is a lot. But if you can, 3 is not, it's not that far off from like 10 or 12 leagues, I think, if you really wanted to put time to it.
Right, and you're not drafting, like it would be, for me, it would be a lot different if it was like redraft, where you have to draft all those times, you know what I mean? Or, but like for Dynasty, you just sort of roll it over, so it's not, you're not, all that initial energy is spent basically. So, rookie drafts basically is your big time, where all of the time comes at once. But yeah, it's interesting. I always like talking to people that like seeing what the process is on other people when they play bigger leagues, because I always try and improve mine. But now that I've hijacked your show and started asking you questions.
No, you're good. Hey, I like that. It's more fun than sometimes. I'm not want to name names. We've had some people on here who have just like, it's just question. I'm like, all right, I'm out of here. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Like I like to have conversations. So no, I got you. I love it. I'm interested to hear that part of it too. Cause like I said, most of the time I'm talking to people who are max like 12 leagues. Like Dennis, for instance, who's my co-host on here, like he feels like he's capped at 8 to 10. And so we talk about that. Same thing. He's like, I just don't understand how you do it. It's like, it's not. I have one redraft league, and that's kind of my one where waivers are, but that's one of those 12 leagues that I was just telling you about. I pay a lot of attention to because I know I have to, because I'll be able to find players on the waiver wire, but I won't do more than one because I just can't handle it at that point. So I'm right there with you. You said that you've been playing fantasy since about 1992, correct? Was that what it was?
90, it's either, I was doing the math and I was talking about, I owned my first team with my dad, and it was like a neighborhood, so we got in it through our neighborhood, someone that we lived with and lived in the neighborhood with, and I think it was like 97.
Oh, 97.
So I've been doing it for, because then it started a keeper league in Peyton Manning's second year. So I think it was like, whatever that is, like 99 or 2000, but it was a couple of years of a redraft league before that. So, but yeah, it was, so say 96 or 97.
All right, so you've been playing much longer than me, so that gives, that is what it is. My question, I guess I was trying to lead to was, what is your favorite form of Dynasty? I know you were talking about, you were playing in Dynasty. Do you mix it in like IDP? I know you mentioned Devy. Like, what's your favorite one that you love to dive into, or what do you have more of in your mixture of 25 leagues?
So people have asked me about like playing Devy and IDP. I can't do those because if I sort of take the dive into, I'm in one Devy league. If I take the dive into IDP, like I will go down a rabbit hole. The last time I went down a rabbit hole, I came out writing 2 books. Like I don't know where, I'll just dig myself a hole that I'll never come out of if I start studying IDP, because I'll try and come up with like a projection model and all these things. So I am sort of reluctant to take any steps on IDP, and I sort of stay away from Devy for a lot of the same reasons, because it's just, sort of know once I go there, it'll just become even more of an in-depth thing. And I worry about, I have to maintain some mental sanity at some point. So I haven't taken too big a dives into those. But I really like playing. I would say a majority of my leagues are start one, just because when I started to play and started doing startup drafts, like that was what the common form was, and I've just kept those teams. But I haven't gotten in a startup that isn't super flex in 3 years, maybe something like that. Like it's been a while since I've added a start one league. But yeah, I like super flex. I like 2 tight ends. Like if playing 2 tight ends, I think it really opens up a whole different position, because it forces you to start a lot deeper down the line in terms of players. And anytime you can bring more players, I mean, that's the benefit of Superflex, because it makes more people valuable. And so I like those, and I like rosters I like deeper rosters with deeper starting lineups and less starting requirements. So for instance, like I like the hyperflex formats where you have to start like 1 running back, 1 wide receiver, and then you can start like 6 flexes or whatever that, or whatever the flex number is. But I like those minimal starting requirements, and it gives you a lot of different avenues to explore a strategy and implement it.
Yeah, I like that. I have one league like that. One of the leagues I'm in with the Dynasty Nerds group, you got the 1 quarterback, 1 running back, 1 wide receiver, 1 tight end, and then we have 8 flex spots, and it can be anything. Now, there's a limit on technically 1 super flex spot, so you can start 1 other quarterback, but then everything else is anybody you want. If you want to draft a bunch of tight ends or wide receivers, you can only have to have 2 running backs technically if you want to have the 1 guy to replace on a bye. So yeah, I'm with you. It's an interesting way to go about it, because I've always, or at least for the longest time when I first started playing Dynasty, I was very much about wide receivers, because I love wide receivers. Not that I played wide receiver, but I loved watching wide receivers. I just have a fascination with them and the way they play their game, where I kind of feel like this is something I want to get into, obviously, with the analytics. As I was reading some of the stuff you had with your hit rates on wide receivers and running backs, and I was kind of interested on which way you lean, because I feel like lately the way is to go running back, because they seem to give you that value quicker than wide receivers do. Where would you go? Or I'll save that, because we haven't technically dived into the book yet. Last question, then we're going to dive into the book. Favorite team and favorite player? Do you have one?
Favorite team's the Buffalo Bills. I'm a long-suffering Buffalo Bills fan. For as long as I remember, I've suffered through them losing Super Bowls all the way up to, the whole drought, and now back into the playoffs. So the Bills are my team. Favorite player, probably my favorite current player. I love Alvin Kamara, because I was right on him in rookie drafts and drafted him a ton. And it was like that was like one of my first, when I started doing analysis of rookies and drafts and those sorts of things, like he was one of my first big calls.
Very nice.
So I will always be sort of indebted to him for that. And but probably my favorite current player, I would say, just to like root for person wise, is John Brown.
Okay, so I'm gonna touch on
DeAndre Hopkins, the 2 of them.
Oh yeah, dude, I love Nuke. I'm going to touch on the Kamara thing, because then you'll kind of understand where I'm coming from. Same thing happened to me, and many people might not realize that Alvin Kamara wasn't someone a lot of people were talking about, so that was a good call on your part. I think in a lot of my home Dynasty drafts leagues, the 2 that I pay really close attention to, that I'm the commissioner of, he went, I think, like right at the end of the first round or second round. Like, he was not someone a lot of people were talking about. So mine was Philip Lindsay, as I mentioned earlier. He was a guy that I was really high on, so I'm indebted to him forever. He could suck the rest of his career, and he's never leaving my Dynasty rosters, because that kid made me look really smart for at least so far 2 years, and I love him for it. Bills, so you being a Bills fan, I've got to say this because I'm a Browns fan, so I understand the long suffering. It's been quite horrible. I had my hopes high this year with the team we had coming in, and that did not end well. I was actually high on the Bills. I thought they'd make the playoffs. I kind of feel like, it was a great game with what happened with the Texans, but if you guys... It
was a horrible game.
The result was horrible. I will give you that. How do you feel about the fact that, I don't want to drudge up any old or bad feelings here, but you guys have you went to 4 Super Bowls. That's got to be a good feeling somewhat, right? That you guys were at least able to get there. I've seen the Browns make 1 playoff game in my existence, so.
Yeah. Yeah, I was really young when that all happened. Like I remember it, but I was young. I remember the last two Super Bowls, I think. But I was really young when those happened, but I remember them happening. It's interesting. Like, Donovan McNabb was for a long time. I mean, I'm a Syracuse football fan, so I have sort of I liked the Eagles for a long time too, and it was one of those things like the consistency of continuously getting to the championship game. For them, it was the NFC Championship game and losing.
Yeah,
like it says a lot about. Like it's hard to do that. Like it's hard to be that consistent. And so for the Bills to get to it 4 times in a row and lose, like that's a extremely low likelihood event. But to get there that many times, but to lose, it's tough to get there that many times and lose. But I think it's still a really solid accomplishment.
Yeah, I agree. I've talked to, there's a couple Bills fans we had on the podcast last offseason. We were doing different stuff, and we brought them on to talk about the AFC. And they were both, there was 2 hosts for, I wish I could remember their podcast at the moment, but they were split on that. One of them didn't like the fact that they made the 4 and lost all 4 of them. The other one said the same thing. It's a great accomplishment. And I feel like that's the way I'd feel, again, because as someone who's been a Browns fan my entire life, like just seeing them make the playoffs once in my lifetime, like I would love to see them get to a Super Bowl, even if they didn't win it. The fact that you were able to get there, and as you said, 4 times in a row, that it's not easy to do. I think a lot of people think it is because we've seen the Patriots do that over this huge stretch here, and them getting the 6 rings with Brady and Belichick, and people think, oh, it just must be easy, but it's not. Like, that's gotta be extremely difficult. And so for the Bills to kind of be the first team to do that in a way, I think is them. You got them, the Cowboys, Steelers has kind of been like a longer stretch. So I think it's great for them. Unfortunately, not being able to win one obviously probably does suck, but their accomplishment of getting to 4 is gotta be a great feeling if you're a Bills fan. All right, we've eaten up enough time of talking about ourselves here, so let's get into the reason we got you on here, and that's the book, because it is fascinating. As I said, I got a copy the other day, and I've been diving into it. As someone who is not big into the numbers part of it, I find myself very fascinated. I've been mostly paying attention to the running back and wide receiver stuff, like I mentioned earlier. So kind of give us a breakdown of the book and what people, when they buy it, should be expecting when they look at it.
Yeah, so both of my books are designed to be like evergreen strategy books. So this isn't just like a 2020 startup guide or a 2020 here are the players you should pick in 2020. They're both process strategy pieces, long form strategy guides about different aspects of Dynasty. So in 2019, I would say, like, if you're looking for a beginning to end type of book, in terms of a how-to or a look at the entire span of being a Dynasty owner, the 2019 edition I think is probably the place to start. The 2020 edition, it's a little bit different because I wanted to focus on some more specific things, and I promised myself I'd keep it to 100 pages. The goal was 100 pages, and when I put it down on paper, it was 100 pages, and I got it to the number. So I didn't have to cut anything, but the goal was 100 pages. I left it at 100 pages, even though I had to leave. I left a couple of things out, but I wanted some more like detailed, just topical things in the book. And one of the big things was Superflex. And it's the problem the first time around with looking at quarterbacks was I didn't have any like historical Superflex data. And a lot of what I did in the first book, and I've been able to do it again with the second book, is look at startup drafts and identify trends. So, before I wrote the book, I always wondered, people would say, he's a good 5th round startup pick. Well, what does that mean? What is a startup pick actually worth? What is it in terms of expectation? What are you expecting to get out of it? And sort of answer those questions. And so, I went ahead and answered those the first time, and then I wanted to look at it from a Superflex lens this time around. So a lot of Superflex stuff. I have a metric called WARP that is wins over replacement player. And it really, from analyzing whether it's players or picks or decisions, when you sort of look at your decisions through the lens of how many games does it actually win you, it really helps your process in terms of it helps you make better decisions. It helps you make better trades. It helps you win with roster construction changes. It helps you just look at players in a more efficient, effective way, because ultimately that's what you're looking for, is to win more games. So I do a lot of analysis with that. I looked at one question that people had. Like I look at now, I think two players that are really good examples of this. If you just look at like the rookie hit rate for tight ends in the first round, like it's really high. And so, you're expecting, on average, expecting, probably about 2 or so seasons is what you would probably top 12 seasons is what you would kind of be hoping for out of a first round tight end. But I wanted to see sort of how, what does it mean for a guy like David Njoku, who's gotten inside of the line, who's hit for a top 12 season this far in his career? Like, where is he in comparison to a guy like O.J. Howard, who hasn't? Relatively close in draft pedigree, both first round tight ends, at the same level of experience. What do their career arcs look like going forward? And so that's something that I really wanted to look at. And so I look at it a couple different ways. One of my chapters is called base rates, and that's basically looking at the hit rates of players based on what we know about them, which is their draft pedigree and their experience level, and how long they've been in the NFL and haven't hit. And if you sort of use that, and I actually, for my Patreon show, I was talking about this last night, that, you look at guys like Darius Geis and Kerryon Johnson and Ronald Jones, and all three of them have missed through their first 2 years of their NFL career. And round guys drafted in the second round of the NFL draft at running back, they hit 55% of the time. So that's pretty good.
Yeah.
But if you take it out 2 years, and after they've missed their first 2 years, it drops to 26%. Now you can move players around a little bit based on, you can say, all right, well, I think Geis is going to continuously be injured. It's going to be lower than that. Or Geis has been injured and hasn't been able to prove it. I still think he's talented. You could move it up, right? But just thinking and knowing sort of what the prior history is really helpful to make those decisions. So that's something that I really focused on. And the other thing too, I focused on sort of from a player analysis perspective was what is the density, right? So once a player hits, how dense is the hit? And so I think that's really helpful in terms of looking at the trajectory of players. What's it mean for a guy like, Darren Waller? Like when a guy like him hits, how deep do you expect to hit from his low pedigree? So those sorts of things. And I think it's really helpful. You sort of get a better range of outcomes on players, because then sort of how to, what the prior history is on that type of situation, and it gives you a context in which to value them. And then you can, of course, change what your thoughts are. And maybe history isn't the best predictor of any particular situation, but at least and that's all from a player perspective. And then the Superflex stuff, I mean, there's a lot of different stuff on Superflex valuation. But I also wanted to test some ideas, because I've always wondered what trading up in a startup draft, mortgaging a future pick, what that does for your odds of making the playoffs. And I did some polling on Twitter about it, and people thought that it really moved it up. And there was, I think, a third of people thought it improved your odds by like 15% or more. And when you look at it, like that number is way off. It didn't in 2019 move the odds up that much. And, knowing those sorts of things, because the hit rate up at the top of a startup draft is high, but it's not as high as people think. Like that, they're not a given to hit up there. And so when you're mortgaging future assets, just knowing what your odds are and sort of what you're buying by trading up is an interesting thing to know. So I looked at a lot of that stuff and sort of what types of teams win championships. And I went through a whole lot of those different topics, and what's a random future pick actually worth, in terms of what it's going to do for your team. All of those sorts of things I address in the book. And there's a lot of different stuff in there, a lot of them answer questions that have been, I think, accepted as true in dynasty football for a long time, and a lot of things about the values between running backs and wide receivers, that wide receivers hold their value more than running backs at a certain point in the draft they do, but that's not true outside of the top 5 or 6 rounds of a startup draft. Like, that's just not true. And so knowing those sorts of things gives you an upper hand, because you can sort of identify different ways to look at players.
All right, so you touched on the wide receiver running back thing, which I brought up earlier. So I want to go to that because it's something in here that you have the value that changes between running backs and wide receivers. So why do you say that? Because you are right. That is something that is not just in startup drafts, but almost in rookie drafts. It's always draft a running back in the first 2 rounds and then, or trade for a wide receiver, like a second year, third year wide receiver, because that's when they typically, quote unquote, break out. And that's when you want to grab them. So are you trying to say that you should do that, or where is the difference in the value lie with those guys that you were talking about in the book?
So as sort of a fundamental thing, as sort of I guess just a base level understanding, my research has shown, and both books come to the same conclusion on this, although it's in different ways. And both books, by the way, this isn't just an update. Like, this isn't like a textbook thing where you just update a few parts of it and put it out new. It's totally different content, but my research for both of them backed up the same point, which is that as a general matter, when you're comparing wide receivers to running back, every time you take a wide receiver over a running back, it's a losing proposition. Now, unfortunately, we have to start wide receivers, right? You have to draft them. And so the best time that you can ever do so, in terms of the least time you're going to, the time that you're going to maintain their startup value longer, or their market value longer than running backs, the only time that happens is early in a startup draft, in the top 5 rounds. And the only time that you're not hemorrhaging value by taking a wide receiver over a running back is in the top 5 rounds of a startup draft. So the combination of those two things makes, to me, a really optimal strategy is to go wide receiver early. Now, that might cap your upside a little bit, but in terms of protecting your floor and giving you a long-term core to build around, like, that's, I think, the ideal place to go. Outside of that, so outside of the first 5, and maybe if you're in Superflex, maybe like 6 rounds, but I would look to, the players that are sort of how many quarterbacks go, and you can sort of move that number a little bit. But I would say outside the top 75 picks in a startup draft, every time you take a wide receiver over a running back, you're losing value. You're losing functionality in your lineup. You're losing warp. You're losing expected top 24 finishes. You're losing upside, and you're losing the functionality of that you get out of a running back. And at the same cost, anytime outside of the top 75 picks of a startup draft, you should go running back over receiver. Okay. And so, that basically backs up all through. If you sort of look at the players that go in a given range, like that is partially because of the hit rates on positions, but generally speaking, it's a lot tougher to get a wide receiver. It's a lot tougher to predict when wide receiver production is going to happen. And running back production is much, much more predictable in terms of the weeks it's going to happen. Okay.
So while we're talking about this, because what I found fascinating, I was talking about earlier how I've kind of read through some of the running back and wide receiver ones, but where I've really dove in deep on is, what was it? I just had it pulled up. I was trying to get back to the beginning of it because I was, so chapter 4, the 2019 rookie classic guide to navigating future rookie drafts. I was looking at that. Yes. And what I found interesting is also the correlation to what you have in the NFL here. And in a way, I guess you could almost describe it as draft capital. You were talking about how wide receivers drafted, I believe is it the first 3 rounds have a 97? Man, I had it up here and I'm trying to scroll through everything as I'm going through here. There's like a 97%, rate of not getting replaced or not getting taken over. I can't remember the words that you used by the next year.
Survivor rate.
Yeah, survivor rate. That's what it was. So that with that, just using, because as we all are right now, obviously we've got the Senior Bowl game on this weekend. You got the Combine coming in a month. We're going to get ready to head into our 2020 rookie drafts. So is that something that you would suggest paying very close attention to? Because I saw a couple of the guys you had in here with some stuff. Because you have Hakeem Butler in here a lot for some stuff, who is a guy that I loved, but did not come with the draft capital last year. He got drafted behind a bunch of guys where you talk about how key it was that DK Metcalf, Josh Jacobs, AJ Brown got drafted where they were. So is that something with this, with your book that also explains why you should pay attention to that in the NFL draft where these players get drafted?
Oh, NFL draft is if I was talking to someone about this last night, and my sister doesn't watch football, she doesn't know, a tackle from a wide receiver, and I jokingly said that I could just by telling her the rounds of which to target players in terms of their draft pedigree, like I think that she could be field an average team, and just by sort of avoiding bad pedigrees at certain positions. And as a general matter, investing in day 3 wide receivers is a waste of time.
Okay.
They just don't hit. In the top. So I looked at wide receivers going back to 2000. The chart I have here is 2008 through 2016. In the first 3 years of their career, 3% of day 3 wide receivers hit for a top 24 season.
Wow.
Let me say that again. 3%.
Yeah.
And now, if you look at it, the day 2 receivers hit on average 18% of the time. So that's still a really low number, right? And that's just in the first 3 years. So, but people make, one of the things I talked about was people make these, instant impact type arguments, and I just that doesn't really happen all that often at wide receiver. It does. I mean, there's players that do it, but it's we sort of gloss over how many misses there are when we talk about guys like Terry McLaurin or, he's one of the good examples of this, or DJ Chark. Like, we gloss over a lot of the misses when we talk about those guys. Yeah. And so day 2 wide receivers, 18% of the time they hit in the first 3 years, and for day 3, it's 3%. And so that's 6 times. You're 6 times more likely if you're taking a day 3 wide receiver or a day 2 wide receiver over a day 3 wide receiver. And that's still, that is the hit rate in round 1. So just to give you an idea, in those first 3 years, it's 48%. So just a massive drop from going from round 1 to round 2, and then from round 2 to round 3. Basically, each round you go, you cut it in half. Mm-hmm. And so, I think being cognizant of that and being careful of those things, it's really important.
Yeah, what I would say on that, the wide receivers that you were just talking about, like Terry McLaurin, and last year, I'm trying to remember, we had one good wide receiver out of that rookie class last year. I think we've all kind of gotten spoiled by that 2014 class where you had like the Odell Beckham, Sammy Watkins, Mike Evans, where all those guys almost immediately made impacts on their teams. And so we kind of expected that every single year, and it really hasn't happened. You've had, off the top of my head, Amari Cooper had a really good rookie season. I want to say, who was this? I know you had in here Juju. Obviously, that's a lot of people are expecting big step forward for him this year because of what he did last year. DJ Chark in his second year this year. And then you were just mentioning Terry McLaurin. I think really A.J. Brown kind of did it at the end of this year, but yeah, Terry McLaurin and DK Metcalf had decent years this year that maybe some people weren't expecting based on where they landed, maybe kind of the outliers in the data that you have here. You were mentioning another thing. I'll kind of want to dive a little bit more into how did you come up with your density and base values when you were talking about that for like your running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends?
How did I come up with it? Yeah. Well, I basically, the base rates and the density rates basically break up 2 different things. So base rates basically measure how likely a player is to hit if they haven't hit yet. So, for example, if Kerryon Johnson hasn't produced a top 24 season, and just by the way, I identify a hit as a top 24 season for a running back or receiver, and a top 12 finish for a quarterback or a tight end.
Okay.
And so a hit is just accomplishing that. And I use that term because to write, a top 24 finish every time I want to express that in a 150-page book would make it 250 pages. So yeah. I just picked a term. And so, so I wanted to look at that and sort of get to how often do these guys actually get inside that top 24 line and are a running back 2 or better. And it not surprisingly, by draft pedigree, it drops every round. Mm-hmm. And as players go along, as they age without hitting, their hit rate goes down.
Okay.
I think that's that makes sense. This is sort of an intuitive matter.
Yeah.
But when you sort of know where the tiers are, where the fault lines are in a player's progression, that's really important because you'll be able to identify, hey, this is a make or break year for this player. Let's either, I don't think it's going to happen and I want to get out and I can see a price fall coming. It really helps evaluate those types of situations. And it also helps evaluate the slow starter. Slow starters at tight end, it doesn't hurt their odds of hitting all that much. Whereas at running back, it hurts a lot. So, you look at those two things and you have to understand each position differently. And then, so that's the base rate thing. And then the density thing, and I kind of call this the Kenny Galladay rule because the Kenny Galladay was a guy that's a day 3 wide receiver that again was down the line in terms of rookie drafts, and he hits for a top 24 season. Well, and so he would have surpassed what you would expect his average outcome to be by hitting. How do you sort of treat that player? What does that progression of his career now look like? Because it puts him on a different track because he's sort of gotten inside the line. And sort of now I know, okay, well, let's look at round 3 wide receivers that have hit. How often do they hit after that initial hit? And so that's really what density looks at. And I think it gives you an idea in terms of it helps you avoid one-hit wonders. Each position is different in terms of how often players bounce back and hit again in their density. But it really helps you get an idea of, am I looking at a one-hit wonder type profile in terms of draft pedigree, or am I looking at a guy that's got an extended long-term history? Treating a guy like, Josh Jacobs, for example, first-round running back, that hits like that's an incredible career arc in terms of fantasy value. Whereas, if you picked a day 3 guy that hits, a Tariq Cohen type with a lower pedigree, or, pick a day 3 running back that's hit, their career arc they're different. And so understanding sort of what you're looking for, those are extreme examples, but knowing what to look for in their career arc is really, really important. So that's what density measures.
Okay. Yeah, I was going over some of that earlier, just kind of scrolling through. Like I said, I was really trying to focus in on the QBs, wide receiver stuff, and then the rookie stuff. And I was looking at the one hit, what'd you have? The one hit wonder rates and everything on here, which I thought was very interesting. So, let's see here. You have on here something that I thought was very interesting, the way that you worded it, because it's definitely true in NFL football, so I'm curious as how it translates to fantasy football. You have in here succeeding at the most important position, QB. Why is that?
Well, it's tough, and I think that we overstate, and I am guilty of this, probably not at the most guilty aspect of it, but I'm guilty of it. People talking about how successful Baker Mayfield was going to be after his rookie season. Yeah.
Now be careful.
It got totally out of control.
Be careful.
It got totally out of control.
Be careful what you say about my boy Baker here, because I will cut the podcast off. I'm just letting you know.
No,
I'm just messing with you.
I'm a pro Baker guy.
Okay.
I'm a pro Baker guy.
Perfect. All right. Then you can continue.
I like Baker Mayfield. I liked him coming out of college. I liked him. I liked him coming out of college. I liked him in his first season, and I like him as a player. Mm-hmm. And I think he's entertaining, right? I don't have a problem with Baker Mayfield. What I think he is a good example of is that everything has a cost, and a lot of these things are questions of cost. I can like Baker Mayfield, but putting him off of less than a season of production without a high end finish in terms of a seasonal finish, up at QB4 in a super flex draft, that's suicidal. And I hadn't written that part of the book and gotten to that research when that was happening. But now, I look back now and I say that you just can't do that again. You know what I mean? That you just can't make that mistake in terms of drafting someone so high. And when you look at the base rates of these guys, like 45% of the top 10 quarterbacks hit for become long-term starters. Mm-hmm. That's not a high rate.
No, not at all.
In terms of, I mean, if you it's worse than a coin flip.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can like Baker, but keeping him in context is a different thing. And the hit rates like for 101 guys is only like 55-60%. And you would think like of everything, like they would have the best shot with everything that's put into investing in quarterbacks. It's still more than a third of them flunk out.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so looking at those things and having an idea of context and just of the quarterback position, I think it's really important to look at career arcs there. And I sort of dove into that in the Superflex chapter.
What before we move off from the quarterback, so what exactly, or I shouldn't say exactly, how what's the best way to look at them then? Like how much production are you looking for to kind of move those guys up there? You said obviously 1 year of production for Baker, and there was a lot of people who were drafting him as like the second or third quarterback even, not just in super flex drafts, but in regular drafts as they thought he'd be a top 3 quarterback moving forward. How much production do you want to see out of your quarterback before you're willing to take them that high?
I think you need elite production. Okay. And it's a little bit of a moving scale in terms of pedigree, but generally speaking, if you and I put in the book like some trademarks to some trend marks to look for. The guys that are like truly successful, they tend to hit for a younger top 12 season than guys that tend to be one-hit wonders. Mm-hmm. Like the difference between their hits, the long-term guys and the one-hit wonders, it's like a year in terms of, I think it was like 23 and change for guys that were long-term hits, and the guys that were one-hit wonders, like they hit at age 25. And so that's like a really important thing to look for. When does a person first get there? And then one thing I also looked at is, the difference between a quarterback that has produced a top 12 season and hasn't, mm-hmm. in terms of NFL starts, right? Because if you're playing Superflex, upside's important, but you really need quarterbacks that are going to be, that are going to have longevity. And knowing that a guy like Sam Darnold is in this year, like this is a do or die year for him. Uh-huh. And I don't think at this, I mean, if you look at, the average quarterback, the average top 10 pick in the NFL draft that doesn't produce a top 12 season starts 50.25 games. So 50 and a quarter games in their NFL career. And you know what that coincides with? Year 4 in the NFL.
Okay.
and so you look at a guy like Darnold, and you look at, he is on a track where he is going down. He's been in this will be year 3.
Yeah.
The difference between guys that miss in year 3, it drops you significantly. If you missed through 3 years, it drops you significantly in terms of your future production. So sort of knowing that career arc, that is a big tier break in terms of future production. So you get a guy like Daniel Jones. I mean, I've seen some drafts where him and Sam Darnold are going right next to each other. Like, we can not like Daniel Jones, or different people have sort of different positions on Daniel Jones. I look at the profile, top 10 pick, and you get basically another year on Darnold. And I don't know about you, but I'm not really buying what the Jets are selling in terms of how Gase has just been terrible at producing players. And so I am pretty bearish on a guy like Darnold, just because of where he is in his career arc and sort of how fragile that long-term ability is at that point.
Yeah, I mean, not to get too far off the book here, but I was with you on the Gase Darnold stuff. I hated Gase coming over there. I mean, I look at what Brian Flores has been able to do in Miami, and how all these players who have now left Miami, how good they've looked in other organizations that were under Gase that did nothing like this, and then seeing him come over to the Jets. I'm with you. Darnold was a guy who a lot of people loved, obviously. I was with you on the Baker Mayfield stuff. I was thrilled when the Browns drafted him. He was my favorite quarterback, but number 2 for me was Darnold. So I still like Darnold a lot, and I'm right there with you. I'm worried that this might honestly be the end for him. There's a couple more questions.
Just on that point while we're talking about it.
Yeah.
top 10 picks in the NFL draft at quarterback position. If they've missed through 2 years, if that's what we know about them, that they've missed for a top 12 season through 2 years, their odds of producing a top 12 season in their career is 47%.
Wow.
So you're a top 10 pick. You go forward, you're a top 10 pick in your third year with 2 misses on your record, it's 47%. If you miss a third time, it drops to 11%. So that's a massive difference.
Yeah.
This is a massive year for him.
Oh, yeah. I'm trying to, well, Josh Rosen's out the door anyways, I would think. So I was trying to think of going through this year. So I don't know off the top of my head. I'd imagine you probably know because you've obviously done all the research for this. Did Kyler Murray hit a top 12 this year?
He did.
He did. Okay. So he's somewhat safe. Who else am I thinking of? I know Haskins didn't. Who else? Jones. We were just talking about him. Did Jones hit? Jones did not hit. There was no way he hit top 12 this year, did he?
No, he didn't. He's an interesting one, though, because he was injured and stuff, but I think he had 3 QB1 weeks or some crazy thing like that. I think it was 3 QB1 weeks. So he's an interesting one in terms of trajectory. But between him and Darnold, like if you get any discount on Darnold or on Daniel Jones compared to Darnold, you should. I think that between the two of them, I would pretty clearly want to have Daniel Jones over Darnold.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you on that. Matter of fact, just to touch on him before I ask you this next question, I was in a super flex rookie draft last year where I got Daniel Jones at the 6th pick of the 2nd round, which I thought was just ridiculous because in super flex, especially in rookie drafts, you've got to value those quarterbacks because of just using, before I even obviously heard any of this stuff from you or read anything, the NFL draft capital alone of him being a top 5 pick. I think it went 6, so top 10 pick for the Giants. You had to value him highly. So I'm with you on that, taking him over Darnold right now. This kind of caught my eye here, and so I want to ask you about this because I feel like it's something that is very prevalent here in the fantasy community, a lot like the wide receiver running back debate. Consistency. A lot of people say that there are a lot of players that are very consistent and that's what you should go for. So you have in here that consistency is a myth. Why do you say that?
Because it is. I think it's a myth for a couple of reasons. As a general rule, there is nothing that says you can't point to data that suggests that teams that are more consistent week to week are better. Okay. In terms of, and I measured it in a lot of different ways because I assumed that was true. I just assumed, teams that, if you get a bunch of guys that perform the same, that they're going to be better just on average. You would think they'd be better. And so I was really looking for it, and I looked at a lot of different ways, and there's nothing to suggest that teams that are more consistent perform better records. And when you think about it, I went through, I had a sample of 52 leagues with 12 teams apiece. And so I went through and I looked at all of those teams, and I did a whole bunch of analysis on the leagues and their luck and, all of those things. And the way you would measure to see if consistency is good is you would look to see the standard deviation, and teams that have a high standard deviation, you would expect to be, suffer in record, and teams that have a low standard deviation or perform more consistently would have a higher record. And it's a totally random walk. It's a totally random walk. And so when you sort of understand that and you start from that premise, that creates a lot of value opportunities, because when there's a narrative on a player that is, always inconsistent, well, you're starting 10 players or 9 players or 11 players or whatever your roster is. You're starting all of those guys, and between all of them, you're going to have up weeks, you're going to have down weeks, but you're sort of putting them all together in a lineup, and you can't, they're going to have peaks and valleys, and they're going to intersect with each other at different points. So, so I don't think that when you look at the data, there's nothing to really suggest that those things matter. And it's a lot more, it's random how that happens. And you look at the thing that if you were just to take, to say, hey, what do you want to do in terms of how should I win more games? Just someone that has never played fantasy football before. Well, you'd say score a lot of points, right? And 95% of your all play win percentage is dictated by how many points you score, right? Like, obviously, the more points you score, the better your team's going to be.
Exactly.
And so I don't, but the order of the what people sort of get hung up on, I think, is the ordering of those points. And I don't, just give me players that are going to score a lot of points. Like Mike Evans this year.
Yeah.
Like Mike Evans won you more than a game over replacement. And you know what? A lot of a good chunk of his production came in a handful of weeks. But you want to know what? When you were never going to not play him.
Yeah.
Right? He was always going to be in your lineup. And so you captured it all. And in the weeks that he played like really well and was a top 5 wide receiver, you probably won. Mm-hmm. Right? You probably, like the game that he went just totally off. Like, you probably won that week, and it was probably just fueled by him. And you know what? The other weeks, like, that you have 9 other guys on your roster. And so those dip weeks matter a lot less than the high upside weeks matter. And so that's sort of the premise. And then if you look at it, like, wide receiver is inherently inconsistent. So as a general rule, if you have a receiver on your team that finishes half of the weeks as a top 24 receiver, and we're not even talking about a really high threshold. We're talking about a wide receiver 2 finish or better. Uh-huh. They've had an outstanding season.
Yeah.
People sort of are like, we put Michael Thomas on a pedestal, and we should. And Devontae Adams was this way, I think, last year. Mm-hmm. I think it was, or 2 years ago, where he had this incredible floor, where he had, all of these games like above 10. I think it was like above 10 points. Yeah. He had all of his games. Like those things are rare, and we celebrate them because they're rare. Mm-hmm. But wide receivers are highly fluctuating, and so if you get half of your games out of a receiver are top 24 weeks, like, they've had a really good season. And so, but people sort of see the fluctuation at the position and don't, and get sort of annoyed by it, or it doesn't feel quite as good because your guy had a down week. But in reality, if half of them are top 24 weeks, you've had a good season. And so that's really the thing that I think about it. And at running back, like, I don't want consistency at running back. Mm-hmm. What I want is a running back that I know when I put in my lineup has the chance to score a lot of points. Now, if you take that back for a second, like, Latavius Murray this year, when you put Latavius Murray in your lineup this year, like, you knew, especially, like, there were some people that came into the season thinking, oh, he might be a solid flex play. But as the season went on, like, that became kind of clear that wasn't going to be what happened. But when Kamara missed time and you put Latavius Murray in your lineup, you knew the exact weeks to do it because Kamara was out, and you got a huge windfall from that. Like, he won you close to a half a game over replacement in like a really short sample size. And so consistency at running back, you can capture running back. You can capture the running back upside weeks because you have the ability to know sort of when the starters are going to be out. And at receiver, I would much rather there's a natural inconsistency at the position. So give me the receiver that has a high likelihood to finish as a top 24 receiver for the season. Mm-hmm. Give me that guy, and I'll let the chips fall where they may in terms of the ordering of the points.
All right, so with you saying that, I wonder if this is kind of falls into chapter 6, which I thought was interesting because a lot of people do tend to avoid this part of the discussion in fantasy, in my opinion. And I do see a lot of the warp talk in here, so you may have already addressed this a little bit when you were talking about warp. But is embracing the randomness. What do you mean by embracing the randomness of fantasy here?
Yeah, so we overstate our ability to predict this, mm-hmm. and we're not in control of players, and we don't have a way to influence the outcome of a player's career. But we talk with such certainty about their outcomes and all of those things. And in reality, there's a lot of randomness that goes on, and that we should appreciate that and learn how to embrace it. Mm-hmm. And so what I mean by that is, like, you look, and I did a lot of research on this, and I did a lot of different Twitter polls, and they're not scientific, but I think they're at least true intuitively, people overestimate their ability to win leagues. Mm-hmm. And I went through an experiment with my league, and it was a startup draft that I did, and there were some good owners in it. And so I went around and I asked them all. I said, what's the chance that you have of winning a league in year one? And the average estimate was 22.4%. Mm-hmm. Well, it's a 12-team league with only one champion. Okay, so the odds of actually winning the league are 8.3% on average. So people were overestimating it by almost 3 times the likelihood. And so when you take a step back from that has massive implications, right? People are way over certain about their outcomes. That means they're pricing their future first round pick more cheaply because they think it's going to be a playoff first. And a lot of those picks, the people at the high end aren't going to. Some of the people that are estimating that are going to be closer to 101 than they are to 112. Mm-hmm. And so when you sort of look at that has real implications. And that typically means that those picks, the odds of having those picks be higher, right? They're actually, people are underestimating their ability to fail, I guess would be the better way. They're underestimating the likelihood their pick's going to be really high in a draft, so they're more likely to move off of it.
Right.
And then when you sort of look at and I did a lot of just random simulations, and one of the things was that rookie picks are undervalued based on, people look at them and say, oh yeah, it falls between 6 and 7 in the startup draft. Like that was the majority of what people thought. Mm-hmm. A first round pick in a rookie draft was between picks 106 and 107, which would be the exact middle of the round. But when you actually look at it and you sort of go through the values of these players and you use Warp to sort of look at these things, where the actual pick is, where the random pick is 105. Mm-hmm. Because we don't appreciate this, but there's a big difference between 101 and 102. Yeah. Right? And the chance to get that high pick those picks have a much higher upside than the difference between 111 and 112. Mm-hmm. Right? Like the gap there isn't that big, but the gap at the high end is really big. The gap between 106 or 101 and 106 in terms of valuation, in terms of future wins over replacement, is like the gap between 107 and 312.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
2.5 rounds. And so that's how important getting those shots are up at the top, because they can really move the needle. And if people are underpricing that and sort of not appreciating the chance that their pick is that high, by embracing the randomness, it's just one of the things I talked about, that it's a high upside type of bet, because if you get a couple of those that crack, top 3 picks, mm-hmm. like this year, like that can, good luck for the league to catch you. And, and so that's a lot of it. And there's a lot of other things, but I think that's probably the best example of like how randomness can really come into it. And just don't overestimate your ability to appreciate. Don't overestimate your ability to predict things, because a lot of these things just aren't, we can't get that great at it. So just appreciating that, because we're not in control of it. Mm-hmm. So just appreciating that and not making huge bets on things you can't control, or those things will help you long term avoid missing.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to lie, that does hit a little bit home for me. In my main home Dynasty League this year, I was boasting very much as being the first back-to-back champion in our league, and that failed. My team kind of fell apart there in the championship round, mostly because I had, as you were just talking about, a lot of guys that I thought were very consistent. I didn't take into effect the valleys that they could hit. One of the guys we were talking about earlier, Nuke Hopkins, I just expected he was going to be a top 3 wide receiver every single week of the season, and I was going to be ready to roll because I had him, Adams, and then you have, as you mentioned, the randomness of actual football happens, and sometimes you're not going to get those outcomes, and it ended up costing me a championship. I got a little bit too ahead of myself, traded away what would now have been pick 1.2 in this year's draft. I now no longer have it to try and get some depth to help what I thought was going to be a championship lineup. So I do agree with you. That's kind of a shift that I've changed in my narrative of, I'd say, the past couple years, where when I first started out in Dynasty, I was one of those guys who was trading away picks like I was giving out candy at Halloween. I was like, give me these players because you can't trust these rookie picks and everything. And I've really kind of changed and come back around on that and tried to save picks and even trade away guys that I thought might be coming toward the end of their careers to get more picks, even if it's just like the second round, especially in drafts like this year, as you were just mentioning how deep it is. To kind of help build my team. All right, so last chapter here, and then I'll let you get out of here as we've been going for a little over an hour right now. Your strategy implementation, and one of the things you kind of already talked about here with the selecting the wide receivers at the history of top 24 finishes, so we'll skip over that one since we talked about that. Your first one here, trade down from picks in the top 2 rounds in a startup draft to acquire additional startup picks. Why? I just kind of want a quick a quick summarization of why you have these as your strategy implementations here?
I looked at the data and it suggests that teams that trade up don't really, especially when they mortgage a future first round pick, it doesn't really help you as much as you think.
Okay.
And so there's especially in Superflex, I think this is true. If you're willing to move down out of the first couple rounds and accumulate a lot of picks, and even if they're future picks or if you can get multiple shots in the top 75, I mean, if you're picking in the first 6 rounds, if you're picking 7, 8, 9 times, I mean, your odds of hitting really improve. And, I always say I like to leave the first 6 rounds of a startup draft with 5 guys that hit. It's a lot easier to hit on 5 guys when I'm selecting 8 or 9 times.
Right.
And, you do those things, and people overestimate the ability to even in the first round, they overestimate the hit rate. And they think, these guys are sure bets. And, we're debating between, is this guy, could he finish his running back 10, or has he got running back 5 upside, or those sorts of things? Like there's a huge miss rate in there.
Yeah.
And people sort of gloss over that a little bit. So I think moving down in a startup draft, and I think you can do it both ways. I actually think if you sort of are really, really selective at wide receiver, I think you can trade down, accumulate future assets, and contend early in a startup draft or early in a startup league.
All right, these next 2 are very interesting to me. They're both centralized on the running back position. Optimize roster construction, selecting twice or 3 times as many running backs compared to wide receivers to your roster.
Yes. You don't want to. The running backs are higher upside. Mm-hmm. And when you sort of go through, all of the things that we talked about, the running backs are higher upside. Even if they don't hit for a top 24 season, you can still get a massive outcome from them. Raheem Mostert, Damian Williams, examples from the last 2 years of guys that made difference making championship outcomes for teams that were nothing early in the season. So having more shots at running backs, there's a much higher chance that the running backs that you have rostered that are way deeper in startup drafts have a chance to help you. It's still a low probability, but they're much more likely to do it than wide receivers.
And then sticking with the running back theme here, this one I found really interesting because I feel like we do kind of value the committed backfields and the fact of guys who are like, this guy's, I'll use the Ravens, for example, this past year. A lot of people were very high on Justice Hill because they thought, he's going to be the receiving back. He's going to get a lot of the receiving work, where Mark Ingram is going to be kind of the main guy that they use rushing. Justice Hill, great pick in rookie drafts. Not saying that he won't do anything, but this year obviously was a huge letdown. You put here, prefer backup running backs over receiving centric committee running back. So kind of give us an idea of why you say that.
Because the upside's higher.
Okay.
And so you take a guy like, Alexander Madison, right? Like he's essentially a binary thing. He's either going to sit the bench on your league or he's going to start. Mm-hmm. Right. It's not because, and the reason that he would start is because, Dalvin Cook gets hurt.
Right.
Or Dalvin Cook gets suspended, or Dalvin Cook goes someplace else. For some reason that Dalvin Cook is out. That Dalvin Cook is not in the lineup, so it's going to be Alexander Madison. And typically we know those things in advance, at least a week at least an hour and a half in advance, right? Because, it might be an injury or whatever, but we will tend to know. And when you get those opportunities, they have high upside. Latavius Murray is a good example of this. 2 years ago, if you had put Latavius Murray and TJ Yeldon, there was like a stretch of like 6 to 8 weeks where if you just put those two guys in your lineup because they were playing as backups, but had a stretch that basically went for almost 2 straight months back to back where you could have put them in your lineup, it would have added you a win over replacement. Those two guys in those short sample sizes. Those things don't happen for guys like Nyheim Hines or, I don't know, Theo Riddick is an example of a guy that used to be people would like him in a committee backfield. Those guys don't tend to move the needle. It's the guys that come in and can get 15 plus touches and have two-way ability that can do so. So I value the guys like that are straight backups and it maximizes the injury rate at running back too. It's sort of it's the opposite. You're taking the opposite bet on that.
All right, and then last question to get you out of here. You have in here, it's back in Chapter 5 with the Superflex of how to identify long-term success. How do you identify long-term success and how it helps your fantasy team?
Yeah, I would just say you should be pretty selective on the quarterbacks you take.
Okay.
And you want to look at quarterbacks, and I go through a whole process in there, and there's some metrics that you can look at in the book. But I think generally we don't appreciate the miss rate on quarterbacks, especially when we're drafting them in like super flex drafts and we're drafting younger ones, and how tough it is for them to truly hit and be meaningful. And generally speaking, like I worry about the one-hit wonders because those tend to be the guys that you pay up a lot for and miss. And so I identify in the book a couple of different ways to look at those guys and sort of, the age and what they hit and sort of how good they are with their initial hit. Those will tell you a lot of different. Those will give you a lot better idea on how to avoid those one-hit wonders.
All right. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for jumping on here with me today. I really appreciate it. This has been extremely interesting. I'm looking forward to diving more into this, especially, like I said, I'm really intrigued by the rookie pick stuff you had, and there was kind of eye-opening some of the discussions you had with the wide receivers. We already talked about some of those guys, Josh Jacobs. Where can we find your book? Where can we get your book? Let us know the name of the book again and anything else you want to tell us before we get out of here.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.
It's fun, and I hope you're enjoying your weather more than I am.
I definitely am.
You can find the book at analyticsofdynasty.com/shop. The 2020 edition, so a lot of these things we just went through are available for $30. It's a PDF form, so when you press enter on the payment, it'll send you an email and you'll actually get a link confirmation to download the book. You can download it, have a PDF, and then when you're trying to make trades or anything, it's always accessible. You can always have it and look to the rates or whatever chapter you want to check on the info for what you're looking for. It's always available to you. The 2019 edition is also on sale. It's for $20. I put it on sale when I released the 2020 edition, so you can do that if you're newer to Dynasty. If you're thinking about taking the plunge and saying, hey, I just don't know what picks are worth, or what am I doing? That'll give you a great jumping off point. And there's some stuff for all types of Dynasty owners in there. But if you're brand new to Dynasty, I'd really, really recommend the Analytics of Dynasty 2019 edition as well. And you can get them both. They're not really that duplicative. You can also find my Patreon channel. I do a Patreon podcast thing. I have a group me that are subscribers to the book, and my Patreons. We're in there. We're going through a couple of startup drafts right now. I mean, it's mid to late January, and I've got a couple different people in startup drafts. So we're talking about picks and identifying some players already, some different formats and stuff. There's a lot of interesting things that my subscribers are involved with. We talk about all that in our group me. But I've been putting out podcasts in my Patreon account or on my Patreon site, and it's probably been active for just under 4 weeks now, and I've probably put out close to 20 podcasts. Like, it's just a thing I can do easily at night, and I'm like, I'm looking at this. I'm like, let's just record it. So all of that stuff's coming out, and you can go to patreon.com/analytics of dynasty for as little as $4 a month. You can get in on that. So, awesome. And follow me on Twitter at McNamara Dynasty, and you can check out the Analytics of Dynasty podcast where you get your podcasts.
Yeah, well, I didn't know about the podcast, so I'm going to have to download that today and subscribe for sure, because that's in
I try and keep it hidden.
Well, hey, you shouldn't, man. I'm telling you right now, because all this stuff has been awesome. I do want to touch on one thing you mentioned right there. It's worth more than $30. I feel like you're kind of shorting yourself on that, because it's awesome. And the new guys to Dynasty that you were just talking, or girls, it is well worth it. I was definitely going through that stuff with the draft picks. I love the way that you compare it to what it's worth to startup picks and everything else in there. It's very, very helpful for people, even for people like me who've been playing. I've been playing for over a decade, and even looking at some of that stuff you have in there, it's interesting to see the data that you've put with it. And like we talked about earlier, the way that you've kind of shown maybe certain things we've been told all our lives in fantasy aren't necessarily true. So it's worth more than $30. I promise you, if you guys buy it, not even if, when you guys buy it, you'll get your money worth out of it within minutes of you reading this book. It is well worth it. I have it right on my phone, as you were just talking about. Very accessible, very easy to get into. Follow him on Twitter, jump in the Patreon channel, download the podcast. I promise you, you guys will be much more successful in your Dynasty leagues listening to Jordan than me, because I don't follow the randomness like Jordan does. I believe that I know the future, and we've seen how well that's worked out for me so far this year. So, Jordan, seriously, thank you so much for jumping on with me today. I hope we can talk again soon, because I'd love to bring you on throughout maybe the draft process and talk about different stuff you see, because you definitely approach things with a different mind than I do, and I always love seeing the analytics side of it, because I'm just honestly not that good at looking at the numbers and everything and putting all that stuff together. But I really do appreciate you jumping on with me today. I hope you have yourself a good weekend, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll be glad to come back in the springtime.
Prepare for glory! I want to know if you got your popcorn ready. Do you got your popcorn ready? I came out the womb, I was ready. And he's hit the end zone for an unbelievable touchdown.
I would be honored if you played football for this team.
Throw it up above his head. They can't jump with me. Golly.
Oh, they tackled at the 40-yard line. Who can make a play? I can. Who can make a play? I can.
Hey there, Galaxy fans. Switch to Sprint and get both an unlimited plan and the Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus included for just $35 per month per line for 5 lines. All you need is approved credit and an 18-month lease. No trade-in required. Visit a Sprint store, sprint.com, or call 800-SPRINT-1. S10 Plus 128 gigabytes after $26.67 per month credit. Apply within 2 bills. If canceled early, remaining balance due. Unlimited basic after $131.21. Pay $32 per month per line without auto pay. Coverage and offer not available everywhere. Excludes taxes, fees, and roaming. Speed maximums use rules. $30 activation fee and restrictions apply.